I'd like to welcome all of you who are attending this online event. This is the second event in the Humanities Center at Texas Tech's Forest theme. That's our year-long scholarly theme for 2020-2021. I'm Dr. Michael Borshuk from the Department of English. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and I'm very pleased to bring you here for this exciting panel tonight, the evolution and ecology of forests. We brought in the scientists tonight to keep us honest as we talk about forests all this year. Before I turn things over to my colleague Bruce Clark, who will be tonight's host and will moderate discussion after the panel, I just want to call attention to some upcoming events in the forest theme. As you can see, we have 2 a month for September, October, and November. And so after tonight, our next event will be October the 15th at 7:30 p.m. when Chris Whitmore, the archaeologist, will be leading us through a web exhibition on Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. All of these events, pardon me, you can find at our website, humanitiescenter.ttu.edu, under the events tab, and that's on the top right-hand side of the web page. There's also a link from the splash page at the Humanities Center website under the forest theme announcement that you can find. I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media. If you use Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, if you search Humanities Center at Texas Tech, you can find us on all 3 of those platforms. And if you're interested in previewing the entire forest theme and you haven't listened to this yet, you can listen to our podcast, Humanities Now, which is the official podcast of the Humanities Center. Will be coming out monthly. And our first episode, the September episode, is the forest theme. And we preview all the different ideas that we're going to be following over the course of this academic year. And so that is available basically wherever you find podcasts, but especially Apple Podcasts and Spotify are 2 popular platforms. Excuse me, and you can find the podcast there. Just search for Humanities Now. One last thing before I turn things over to Bruce. The Humanities Center at Texas Tech opens all of its officially sponsored events with an acknowledgement of the indigenous people on whose lands we host our talks and gatherings. And so we'd like to make this statement at the beginning of all official events. And I'm grateful to my colleague, John Bisterian, in Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures, who actually helped me make some revisions to this statement recently. And so I'm very grateful for John's input. The center opens its events with this gesture as part of our commitment to respecting the shared humanity of different populations across diverse cultural traditions, and to remembering with clarity the complex and violent truths of our history. With that in mind, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we stand, the traditional homelands of the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We pay respect to their elders, past and present, and please tonight take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, trauma, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. So with that statement, I'm going to finish my part of the evening, and I'm going to turn things over to Bruce Clark, who will introduce all of our distinguished panelists for the evening. Thanks, Bruce.
Sure thing. Thank you, Mike. And let me just mention for our attendees, it's great to have you with us here. You're who we're doing it for, and we're glad to have you tonight. So you should see on your interface that there's a chat function, which you're welcome to use. Although I think that's sort of so you can discuss amongst yourselves as we go along. There's also a Q&A function, and if you want, and so we invite you to, if you have comments or questions specifically about the presentations tonight, please enter them into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address your comments and your questions as part of the event. Okay. So a bit of introduction here to what we're doing, thinking about forests, what they are, how they work, how they moderate climate at the planetary scale, and thus why their preservation truly matters. We'll be thinking with forests to consider how we modern humans, the occasionally irresponsible beneficiaries of forests, might learn from the trees, as it were, better behaviors, making positive differences in face of the ecological challenges we currently confront. Now, the evolutionary science I've been reading for a while now would suggest that when plants arose as dedicated land dwellers on an earth for which life up till then had been almost entirely a marine or sea-dwelling phenomenon, the plants got by, as Ringo would say, with a little help from their friends, the fungi. Or perhaps with more than just a little help from the fungi. This account of how fungi and plants teamed up to leave the sea and make a break for land, not a new idea. It already appears in Lynn Margulis's popular science text, Symbiotic Planet, published in 1998. Margulis writes there about theories coming forward at that time regarding the coevolution of fungi and algae to form a fungal fusion at the base of the emergence of the plant kingdom. And as the mycologist Merlin Sheldrake tells the story in his book Entangled Life, published earlier this year, quote, plants only made it out of the water around 500 million years ago because of their collaboration with fungi, which served as their root systems for tens of millions of years until plants could evolve their own, unquote. So this insight greatly helps to explain the findings of the new forest ecology we discussed last week in the Forest Program's inaugural conversation on the documentary Intelligent Trees. This film introduced us to the idea of the wood wide web that courses through every forest's soil with elaborate symbioses between tree communities and the mycorrhizal fungi that penetrate and connect their root systems. So if plant roots evolved in the first place hundreds of millions of years ago in collaboration with, if not on the backs of fungal partners, then we cannot be surprised to discover as we tread the forest glens of today, a massively consequential cross-kingdom mutualism beneath our feet. Okay, so tonight we're pleased to hear from 3 TTU scientists who will carry this story forward. First of all, and I'm going to introduce all 3 of them now, and then we'll just hear each of their presentations, and then please hold your applause and your questions and comments until we're done, and then we'll open it up for discussion after the third panelist. But first of all, to get things started, we still need to find out, once plants became established on land, how trees and forests arrived on the scene. So for some answers, we'll turn to Sankar Chatterjee, our first speaker, Paul Whitfield Horn, Distinguished Professor of Geosciences and Curator of Paleontology at the Museum of Texas Tech University. Sankar's research ranges from Mesozoic vertebrates, flight of pterosaurs and birds, and the origins of flight, to mass extinction, macroevolution, plate tectonics, and paleobiogeography. And in recent years, he's also been developing theories on the origin of life altogether. However, this evening, Sankar will talk to us about the origins of trees, and specifically the origin and evolution of forests. And next, John Zach will draw out the role of the fungi in the forest. John is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Texas Tech University with a specialization in soil microbial ecology and mycology, that's the science of fungi. John's lab is involved in projects that extend from the cotton fields of West Texas to the Chihuahuan Desert in Big Bend National Park. John's also co-director of the TTU Climate Center. John's talk this evening is on the fungal ecology of forests. And finally, for this evening, we'll hear from Dylan Schwilk on the wider ecological relations of plants and forests amidst the contingencies of climate dynamics and weather events. Dylan is an associate professor in TTU's Department of Biological Sciences. His lab researches how plant traits influence fire behavior, and in particular, the impact of drought and fire on trees in West Texas mountain ranges, of which I'm interested to find out where those are, but they must be out there somewhere. And Dylan will speak to us tonight about fire and the forest sky islands of West Texas and the Southwest. Okay, so Sankar, my friend, take it away.
Thank you. Now, the basic theme of tonight's talk is forests are the dominant terrestrial ecosystems of our planet. Look around, we see this greenery planet. And the definition of forest is very murky. Some people think it should be, highly dense, tall trees, where the 60 to 80% of tree populations, there. But think about our planet maybe 4.5 billion years old, and for majority of the time, that is 90% of the time, the land was barren and bleak, okay? So plant came much, much later in this bigger perspective. The first land plants appeared in the Ordovician time, roughly about 480 million years ago, at the water stage. How the plant migrate from water to land, and it was followed by the animals also in the same fashion. We'll discuss about these things. And then, mind you, from plant to the forest, it took almost 100 million years, okay? The first forest appeared about 380 million years ago. It took 100 million years from, very simple plant we see today, like club moss, to the formation of the first forest. So I'll really sum up the main events of the plants, mainly how the forest came. And to tackle these big questions, it can be done very easily if we really divide this geologic period into 3 important time. Because as I said, for the 90% of the geologic time, for 4 billion years, our land would be really naked, sterile, only rock. There's no soil, no plant, no greeneries. It was really dark, bleak. And then in Paleozoic time, about, this is the time range, 543 to 245 million years ago, plants are really coming from water to land. In the Mesozoic, we see the really tall trees, both gymnosperms or, and as well as the flowering plants. And finally, Cenozoic, which we are going through. And this is the age of mammals. We'll see the explosive evolution of flowering plants. So these 3 stages, first the very primitive plants, then seed-bearing plants and flowering plants, and then the explosion of the flowering plants. We'll talk about these 3 episodes. That way probably we can tackle these questions. So if we look at this whole geologic period, so you see these 3 big groups of plants. One is called the pteridophytes, that means spore-bearing plants, and then the gymnosperms, which are the seed-bearing plant, all the green Christmas trees, pine, fir, birch, and others. And finally, the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. And one replaced another, but they didn't become extinct. They are still continuing. Still, we can study these pteridophytes. We can study the gymnosperms, angiosperms, all around we see. The evolution of plant, when we talk about plant means land plants, okay? So these charophytes, they are probably the ancestral, DNA analysis suggests. And plant means, botanists, they call it embryophytes. That means embryo, whether it's egg or this sperm, they are enclosed in a sort of very moist chamber. And that's the definition of plants, okay? All plants, all land plants, they have this character. So again, these four important. So what we see really, that there is a gradual evolution of the reproductive organs. We see exactly the same thing among animals also. First is this, these two are spore-bearing plants, and then the seed, and finally the flower will come. So the question is, why did it take so many billion years for plant to invade lands? Okay. See, the main thing is, for example, this photosynthetic bacteria or cyanobacteria, if you go to oceans, you'll see on the top, there are billions and billions of these bacteria. But that really first appeared 4 billion years ago. What do? They can split the water molecule and they can produce food, and they are the producer of oxygen. So all the oxygen we breathe, we have to thank, these simple, lowly cyanobacteria. They're the first one who came up with this idea, how to produce oxygen as well as food. So it took billion years, from 4 billion to about 5, almost 4 billion years to form the ozone layer, because land was very vulnerable, because this deadly ultraviolet radiation is coming. So you need a protection, you need a shield, and there's no shield because ozone layer, which really truly protects us, it really forms from oxygen, okay? 3 atoms of oxygen produce one ozone. So there should be sufficient amount of oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, then and only then ozone can form. So really there's a beautiful correlation between the formation of the ozone layer and slowly the invasion of land. So once ozone layer started forming maybe about 50 million years ago, but it's a very thin layer. Then here, so today, about 10 miles above this surface, you see this ozone layer. These are basically 3 atoms of oxygen, and it protects from this deadly ultraviolet ray. This is why, we can walk on land. And so it took long time to make the land safe. So without the formation of the ozone layer, no organisms, neither plants nor animals, could come to the land. So land was just rocks, there's no soil, nothing. So that was the true story of, our planet. So it was really very ugly. There's no greenery, nothing. So this is how, these freshwater plants, they are coming to the land. Eventually, they will turn into sort of tall trees. So this history we'll be talking, shortly. So this is the transitions, living in the 2 worlds. So this is maybe a little river, and there are lots of aquatic plants are there. Now, there are advantage of living in water because food is plenty and you don't have to support your own body weight. Whereas when you come to the land, there are some advantages: enough oxygen, enough sunlight, enough carbon dioxide, but food is also there in the soil, but you have to take the food from the soil. So there is a sort of mutual, problems. So there are some benefits of living on land. So when this aquatic plant come to the land, there are some advantages because sunlight is brighter, they need sunlight. And then there is more carbon dioxide because this is what plants assimilate. And also there are lots of mineral nutrients. These are of course provided by fungi and others. They're plentiful in the soil. So along with plants, fungi also came and they're really trying to turn rocks into soil. But what are the challenges? Because you see, we take it for granted. But to pull the downward, force of gravity, you have to come up with some mechanisms. And so these are the challenges plants faced, and they slowly improved, okay? So they developed, for example, there's a tendency for drying up, okay, when you come to the land. So they developed sort of waxy substance, cuticles, they developed stomata, they developed vascular tissue, roots and leaves. So it's a sort of long thing. So for example, you see this is a cuticle, this, because of this waxy, it can protect this, it can hold the moisture. Similarly, in each, leaves, you'll see there is sort of opening, and it's like a mouth, open and close. This is how they can allow air to move in and out. So these are many mechanisms they have to develop until they become trees. Okay, it took millions of years. And one of the most important things they developed is a beautiful plumbing systems. Okay, that is, think about, these are two polarity. Here the food is produced, here this nutrient and water is there, here the food is produced. Okay, so there is just like plumbing system, just like our artery and vein. So from this here, it is going, towards the top of the tree, nutrients and water, and here the food is manufactured, it is sort of distributed by phloem. So this kind of plumbing system, until it develops, plant cannot really be successful. So they develop this vascularity or the plumbing systems. And then you cannot be a forest, you need a solid structure. It took again many experiments. Initially, it was sort of, they have cylinder, but its interior is soft or it was hollow. And then it's sort of fibrous composite like tree fern, these are extinct. And finally, conifers, we see this, lignin or woody structure. Until and unless this structure forms, plant cannot be, tall. Now, you cannot be tall, unless there's a good anchorage system. So along with this, height, they also developed a root system. These are the anchoring device. And again, through time, you see very short root and the root is sort of elongated. So now once these two things develop, that is the woody structure, lignin and the roots, then and only then plant can become taller, stronger, and that we'll see. And then finally, we need a solar panel. That is the leaves, okay? Initially there was on leaves, then microfields or, small leaves developed. And finally, if they can flatten, they can capture more sunlight, okay? So we can see this, evolution of these leaves. Fortunately, DNA analysis suggests that very primitive plants, the very first plants which came to the land, they are all around us, like club moss and moss, okay? We can see these are the very first plants, they're at the transition, they're at the water stage, okay? They come to the land, but they need lots and lots of moistures. And then in the Silurian time, you see these vascular plants. They don't have any leaves or, much roots, but they have this, sort of sporangia or, some kind of a ball which contains the spores. And beautiful fossils of, very early vascular plants have been found. So like fern is a very good example, So what happens here, this spore and this spore, and they turn into this very first stage called gametophyte, where you can see the eggs are in a stationary and the sperms are mobile. But they cannot just fertilize. You need some water, which will go down and can fertilize. And so in every tree, you see these two things. One is a small one. This is the sexual stage, or this gametophyte stage. The other is the longer one. This is the sporophyte stage. It's sort of very primitive type of reproduction, and they're still around us. Then there'll be improvement. Now, those who are from New York, they know this Gilboa fossil forest. And this is so far the oldest known forest, about 380 million years. So it took about 100 million years just coming from the water to form these tall trees. Okay, these trees, tree ferns and progymnosperms, they're extinct, but beautiful tree trunks and leaves, they have been preserved. So this is one of this national forest park, you can see it. But the true forest really appeared in the coal forest. It's called Carboniferous coal swamps. All over the world, this is one of the most interesting things, that all over the world, the temperature was equable, and you see these tall trees, okay? And these are often called Carboniferous coal swamp because all the coal you see today, they formed right at this time. So coal is really nothing but the remnants of these, changes of these trees. If you go to any coal mine, you may find the tree trunk, you may find the leaves. So there is no doubt that, coal came from these trees. And so these are, many of these trees, these are not familiar to us. Some still there, but these are all become extinct. Mind you, this is the time when all the continents joined together to form this Pangea. And these forests really, throughout the world, you will find. Okay, all over Pangea, you see these forests. Even in Antarctica, we discovered this forest of the Carboniferous. So these are some of the plants you can see. These are all extinct: Sigillidia, Calamitis, and Medulosa, Lepidodendron, and chordates, but some are still there. And one breakthrough happened during that time is that they came up with the new reproductive structure, that is the seeds. Okay, these are the storage devices for a plant embryo. And seed coats protect embryos from drying, wind, and sunlight. So always it was very difficult when the plants came to the land. Okay, that is drying up. How to cope up with drying up of this embryos. So seed is a sort of wonderful, and if the climate is bad, they can remain dormant for years. From archaeological specimens, people were able to, germinate the seeds, which may be 3,000 years old. One of the most iconic plant fossils is called Glossopteris. If you come to our museum, we have the largest collection of Glossopteris fossils, which I collected from Antarctica. Now think about these lowly plant fossils. They would be the stimulus for a major theory of geology, that's a plate tectonics or continental drift theory. Because these fossils or Glossopteris, they're only found in the southern continents, South America, Africa, India. Mind you, India was at that time part of Antarctica and Australia, okay? But you will never find, if you go to Ohio or in any United States coal mines or European coal mines, you will never find these Glossopteris. So the idea was that, all the southern continents were joined together called Gondwana. So this is really how the concept started forming. So these Glossopteris fossils, they're very important. For a long time, people didn't know what are the Glossopteris because the leaves were only known. So they named different parts of the tree different name. Now, of course, it was possible to reconstruct the whole tree. So this is one of the most wonderful plant fossils that really tells about the continental drift theory. Now, another plants, if you go to New York or Washington, D.C., on the two sides, you may find these are called ginkgo, and ginkgo has been found in this coal forest. So these are living fossils. For almost 300 million years, hardly any change. Now, too much plant is not good either. Because what do? Plant like cyanobacteria, they pump oxygen. So this is the time when the oxygen level was 35%, okay, in the atmosphere. And today it is 21%. So the advantage is if you put too much oxygen, the atmosphere becomes dense and you get all these giant flying animals. Do you like to have a dragonfly? The wingspan is 28 inches, or how about a cockroach, about 12 inches wingspan? So all these giant insects, they really appeared during the Carboniferous time and only possible because the air was dense, lots of oxygen. Now what happens, is a beautiful balance in the atmosphere. So what plants do? They assimilate, they really take carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. Now, so there's a drop of CO2 during that time, and the effect is whole southern continents, that is Gondwana, they were covered with ice age. So although this, there's a sort of forest was there, there's a sort of compensation because the CO2 level dropped tremendously, which might have brought the ice age in the southern continents. So again, you can see this. So here you can see these are all covered by ice. Okay. Here, of course, these are all forest. Here you will see all ice because of the drop of CO2 level. So what happens? This is one of the interesting things, that all the plants, eventually it's a swampy land, they're sort of dumped every year, they'll be covered by sediments, and eventually they turn into coal. And these are the 4 stages of coal: peat, then lignite, then bituminous, and finally anthracite. This is a very pure coal, almost 95% carbon. Again, we found these coal deposits in Antarctica. Now, what would happen? So this is the only time in the geologic period all over the world you see the coal deposits. But today, coal deposit is not forming. Maybe we may find peat. If you go to, say, Florida or Carolinas, you may find the peat formations, but not this coal. Simply because what happens about 60 million years later, a sort of bacteria developed which actually started eating lignin. And that's why the coal formation is not doing. And in the Permian time, so this is the end of the Paleozoic. You see this, Permian forests. Now there's a beautiful story between dinosaurs, and now we are in the second stage, okay? That is the Mesozoic. And here the dominant flora was really this gymnosperms or seed-bearing plants. And also we'll see how the flowering plants started forming. So look at the neck of this dinosaur. These are these giant sauropods. And since like giraffe, they're really trying to take leaves, from the top of the tree. Their necks were really very, very long. So there's a beautiful co-evolution of these, their styles and the food supply. Similarly, other groups of dinosaurs, they started taking this, low fern food, and their neck is short and their head is, continuously pointing towards down to find the ground cover. So again, how these plants modulate or, change the adaptations of animals. Then at the Cretaceous, something would happen. There is a flowering plant would evolve, and all the dinosaurs we see Cretaceous, their head is perpetually pointing towards the ground. Like today's, if you look at horse or cows, just like that. So these low browsers started forming. So this is one of the most mystery about the formation of this, flowering plant. And it happened in the Mesozoic, okay? So this is a flower. Flower is actually the reproductive organs or the sexual organs. And you can see many of the flowers are really hermaphrodite. So where the male and female organs are in the same structure. So what happens? The flower is so beautiful and it has a honey, not for you, but to attract insects. So insect will come and they will, sort of move from one anther to another, and these are actually full of pollens, okay? So if these pollens, then they go to another flower, there's a cross-fertilization, that means, the plant would be much more stout. And Darwin actually worked very nicely about cross-fertilization, why it is so important. So plant sex is always by proxy. Either they need water initially, then air, and finally they are using these insects, birds, mammals, all kinds of things, okay? So they are the now carrier. So this happens in the Cretaceous times when they are, attracting these insects and others for cross-pollinations. Now Darwin said that the origin of flowering plants is a sort of abominable mystery, okay? But no longer that is true, because now botanists found, two important major discovery took place in recent times. One is what is the most primitive plant still exists today? These are called Amborella. Sort of white flower you can see, and only found in New Caledonia. But when the botanists did the DNA analysis, they found this is the sort of, ancestral plants from which all other flowering plants really evolved. Now, China, for paleontologists, is a dreamland. It's a treasure land. And there they found, in fact, I worked there, it's called Jehol Biota. About 125 million years ago, there's a huge volcano and ash pits really covered everything. And there you find this beautiful feathered dinosaur. You find this, dinosaur to bird transitions. You find the insects. You find the wonderful complete mammals with hair. So this is probably, and these United Nations, they make it, sort of heritage center. So this is one of the major discoveries in the last 20, 30 years from China and called Jehol Biota. There they found, mind you, during Darwin's time, no flowering plants were known from this whole Mesozoic. So for the first time, these flowering plants were known from China, early Cretaceous, and this one is called Archifructus. There is another one. These are almost like water lilies, leaf fructus, and so in the whole Cretaceous, there are so many interesting fossils, flowers, and one of them you can see the magnolia. So magnolia tree or magnolia flowers, when you see, it is one of the oldest flower. Okay, so you can tell that in Labak, you can tell your friend that this magnolia, they formed during the age of dinosaur. No doubt dinosaurs saw magnolia. Then about 65 million years ago, there's a real Holocaust or catastrophe, maybe 1 or 2 meteorites sort of collided, and all the dinosaurs died. And along with dinosaurs, all the forests also, they're completely gone. Okay, so again, but plants are much more tougher than animals. Okay, they will regenerate, they will come back. But new casts, so new plants should be there in the scene. Okay, so this is after the dinosaur extinction. These are the third stage, Cenozoic, and the very early stage called Pliocene. Suddenly new forests appeared all over the world. And there you see all these mammals. So mammals and these flowering plants, they evolved together. And so they really cover most of the forest, especially tropical forest. And you can see the Cenozoic forest while looking, elephants and horses. Now, we are so much indebted to angiosperms. All our food comes from angiosperms. Okay, food, cereals, and also all these, important stimulants and the medicine come from flowering plants like caffeine, alcohol, strychnine, nicotine, cocaine, morphine, mescaline, atropine. Mind you, all these drugs, they evolved really to deter insects or other plant eaters, okay? Ephedrine, digitalis, codeine, and even garlic and marigold, they are very good insecticides. So all these things are really evolved just because there will be lots of herbivores, they will eat plants. So to deter them, they developed all kinds of poison and all these narcotics just for this. So today it's a very sad situation about the forest, okay? So here you see the tropical forests, and they are the remnant of the Gondwana, okay? You see in South America, you see in part of Africa, we really destroyed most of the tropical forests. You see part of India and Southeast Asia. So these are the tropical forests. These are dominated by flowering plants. And now, they're really relict, a remnant because of our, greed and others, we really destroyed. Then of course you see temperate forests like, evergreen trees, and finally the boreal forest in the northern area. So look, it took millions of years to establish the forest. Now, Homo sapiens, the most aggressive species, what we're doing it, we're destroying it. Look at these forest pictures, it's really, really sad. Miners, they're going, palm plantations, they are destroying. Look at in Southeast Asia, what is happening? Sumatra, Java, Borneo, if you go there, forests are gone, wonderful forest. Now this orangutan, they're coming to the, cities, and they have no place to hide. So we are destroying forest, and mind you, forest is the largest sink of CO2. So all the global warming and other things. If we retain our forest, probably it could be balanced. Now we are really, not only we are pumping more CO2 in the atmosphere, we are also destroying the sink, that is where the CO2 could be, assimilated. So this is a very, very tragic history that it took millions of years to establish the forest. Now we, Homo sapiens, the most wise man, it means, are destroying it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Shankar, for that wonderful dash through the forests for 400 million years to the point where we are now, where we've really got to wise up, us Homo sapiens, and reckon with how we're going to save what we've got left and get them going back in the right direction. But meanwhile, let's now turn it over to our second speaker, John Zach, on the fungal ecology of forests.
So thank you all very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so thank you all very much for attending tonight. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about why fungi are important in forests, how they function. And there's been some terms that Bruce made and Dr. Chatterjee mentioned about the wood wide world web and about lignin and decomposition. And I'm going to expand on some of that and some of the material that was covered in the previous one. But I think it's important to understand a little bit about what fungi are as organisms, to understand why they're able to do what they do and why they were able to help bring the photosynthetic organisms out of the water onto the land, and what has been going on since the origin of land plants from a fungal perspective. So first of all, fungi have the same cellular structure as us. They are eukaryotic organisms, and they carry out the same functions we do, except their life cycle and their makeup is very different. They are primarily filamentous organisms that grow by laying down more of the filament at the tip. So they grow out in a linear length, and they branch in ways that are unique. So they explore a volume of space around them. So for your interest, so a single filament of a fungus that starts from a spore that grows and produces multiple tips, we call it a hypha. If you have more than one hypha, there are hyphae. And then collectively, all of the filaments are termed mycelium. So for example, the fungus that's growing in your toes right now as athlete's foot, it's the mycelium that's growing through that dead skin. The green spots that are on your cheddar cheese block in your refrigerator, there is mycelium in that. If you like blue cheese, there is mycelium in that. But this is how fungi grow in the world. They produce this net-like structure that explores and expands and moves material within that network. When they talk about a wood wide world web, fungi grow in that web design. And if you can see on the bottom right, that circular picture, these organisms grow out in a circular pattern. The largest circular pattern intact that has ever been measured on the planet is a fairy ring that occurs in Great Britain, which is 2.5 miles in diameter. And that's the largest extent of intact mycelium that we know of. So all fungi grow in this way. And this is how they then interact with plants. This is how they interact with us. This is how they help build soil. They interact with the plants. Everything is involved with this connective web that is exploring the environment around them. Now, the other part, like us, is that fungi are heterotrophic. They can't make their own carbon. They have to get it from previously fixed carbon, which are other organisms. And so fungi are broken down really into 3 major physiological groups based on how they acquire that carbon. and that is they are saprophytic, which means they only grow on dead organic materials. But these are the largest group of fungi. Most of the fungi that we know in the environment are in the saprophytic group. And there are estimated to be about 14 million species of fungi in the world, of which we probably only know at most about 12,000 species. The rest are unknown or undescribed. But what the fungi do is take all the material from previously dead organisms and recycle them back to CO2 and to other inorganic components of nitrogen and phosphorus that's important for all life to exist. So as Dr. Chatterjee talked about the Carboniferous and the buildup of all that carbon, one of the reasons that that happened is that the fungi that carry out this recycling process did not have the enzymes necessary to break down the plant material that was new that the plants were producing at the time in different forms than they previously seen. We don't have that occurring today. So most of the fungi on the planet are decomposers. They're saprophytic. And then we have the group that we don't like a lot, and these are the pathogens. And they grow on living hosts. These are the ones that kill things. These are the ones that get their carbon when the organisms are live. And so, as you know, there is a massive die-off of bananas worldwide because we've planted one species, the Cavendish banana, and there's a fungus that now is very virulent against that Cavendish banana, and it's destroying all of them. And so it's moving around the world. The eucalyptic forests in Australia are being stressed out by a fungus. Sudden oak wilt in California is being impacted by that. So we see this aspect of pathogens worldwide, corn blight. But you know, if you've listened to me talk previously, one of the most important ones in North America has been the chestnut blight, which occurred at the turn of about 1904, in which a fungus was brought in unexpectedly and took over and killed something like 14 million trees within a 40-year period. So we'd lost all that forest component in this part of North America. But where I'd like to spend my time today, I'll talk a little bit about the saprophytes, but from a forest perspective, one of the most important groups of fungi are the symbionts. These are the fungi that form relationships with plants in which there is a symbiotic relationship between the plant and the fungus so that both benefit. And so we know of the lichen symbiosis, and that was important for bringing plants onto the land and still occurs today. But there's also what we know of as the mycorrhizal symbiosis. These are the fungi that are critical for allowing all plants that we see on this planet to exist within the habitats that they do. And as Dr. Chatterjee said, those distribution of plants have changed over time. The forms of the plants have changed over time. The structure of the plants have changed over time. And the fungi have evolved and adapted with them and have allowed them to move to different locations. One of the things I think is amazing that we don't appreciate is forests migrate, but they take long periods of time to migrate. And a lot of that ability to migrate is predicated on having the symbiotic fungi that they need in the locations in which they're migrating to, or if they've lost them from the parts of the habitat from which they've migrated from. Now, we have a bias, and that is, while we think we know about fungi, our understanding as most people are predicated on a very, very small group of processes of what fungi do. So we think of fungi really in the context of food. So we eat the morels that are on the left-hand side. People like morels. People go out and collect morels. You can make a living off morels, right? And then we like the fermentative products that we get from fungi, the beer, the wine. But that's only a very small part of the whole biology of fungi do. And that's the good part. However, we don't like the disease part. And so we have the athletes for the fungus, Epidemophyton flocosum, growing in someone's toes in that picture there. But it's doing the same ecological things that fungi do in forests, or they're doing in your backyard, or they're doing in your compost pile. Or if you're a cotton grower, you do not want Formidatrichum omnivorum growing in your cotton seasons because it produces root rot. But the fungi are carrying out the same biological processes of acquiring carbon. It just, they're growing in us. And we don't, so whenever you talk to people about fungi, particularly people dealing with agriculture, it's a no-no to talk about fungi or to have any fungus associated with it. But here's the interesting thing. Less than 0.1% of all fungi are pathogenic. The other 99.9% are crucial for the functioning of this planet. And without them, we couldn't exist. So let's focus on the saprophytic and the mycorrhizal. And we know about these fungi because these are the ones, the macroscopic forms that we go out and hunt for food or we like to take pictures of. So you have, in the bottom right, you have Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, which is a great looking fungus, tends to be toxic, produces LSD if you know, and so you got to be careful. But some of these fungi are the most toxic organisms on the planet, right? But one of the things I think you need to know is that there is a very specific discontinuity between the fungi that are saprophytic and the fungi that are mycorrhizal. The mycorrhizal fungi have evolved to interact with the plants that they find as hosts, and they don't do the other kinds of processes that the saprophytic forms do. The saprophytic forms get their carbon from decomposition of material, the wood, the cellulose in the wood, the lignin in the wood. But the mycorrhizal fungi have this intimate relationship with their host plants, and they form the microbiome of that plant in the same way that the bacteria in our guts form the microbiomes with us that keep us alive. Now, something you should know, we as humans have no beneficial fungi. You do not want fungi on you, and you do not want fungi in you. You will be dead. You will be dead. So it's the plants, though, that require the fungi. They require the fungi in them, and they require the fungi on them. So in that respect, they have a very different microbiome and interactions than what we do. So a little bit of biology. Symbiotic means two or more organisms living together. Mutualistic means simply both partners benefit. Now, a little bit about the evolution of fungi. Dr. Chatterjee alluded a little bit to this. Fungi are more similar to animals than they are to plants. They evolved from the animal lineage. And when you go from right to left on this cladogram, the titles represent the major phyla: Chytridiomycota, Zygomycota. Those are all the microscopic forms: bread mold, the chytrids. But then we have this group called the Glomeromycota, the Ascomycota, the morels, the Basidiomycota, the mushrooms. Those last three are the mycorrhizal forming species and genera of fungi. Those are the ones that are all associated with the plants. Now, the Basidiomycota and the Ascomycota have also pathogens, and they have the largest group of saprophytes, but the mycorrhizal relationships, the lichen relationships, are all in those last ones on the left. And they are the most recently evolved groups of fungi. So a little bit about, again, some terminology. All mycorrhizal species are mutualistic, but only some are obligate. That means they have to occur. These fungi don't occur any other way. So the basidiomycetes, the mushrooms, the ascomycetes, the morels, they're able to grow as saprophytes, and they can be cultured. But these fungi, if there's a host around, they will grow with their host, and they don't carry out a saprophytic lifestyle. In the other part, the Glomeromycota are obligate symbionts. They cannot be grown as saprophytes, and they cannot be cultured. So they're a very unique group of fungi. But what do? Well, the plant provides sucrose to the fungus, and the fungus, in basic terms, increases water uptake, increases nutrient uptake and availability. It can provide drought tolerance, and it also increases disease protection through the root system. So they're crucial for how plants interact within their environment. Now, worldwide, there are 4 basic forms of mycorrhizae. With orchids, they're a very unique group, but the 2 that are important to forest are what are referred to as the ectomycorrhizae, and they are with ascomycetes and basidiomycetes, and they're with the trees. And then we have the arbuscular mycorrhizae, which are the glomeromycota, and they're associated with grasses, herbaceous plants, temperate trees, and interestingly enough, all tropical forests are in this whole group. So if you look at the distribution, the current distribution of forest worldwide, what you can see is that the boreal regions, which have the conifers, are all ectomycorrhizal. The temperate regions are a mix of ecto and arbuscular, and then the tropical regions are all arbuscular. So the mycorrhizal types and the forest distributions are all linked up relative to the distribution of the fungus and the distribution of the plants in response to environmental factors that regulate that symbiosis. So I want to start by showing a few things about these ectomycorrhizal associations. It's hard to take pictures of these, but these are tree seedlings, and what the mycorrhizal fungus does is extend out the network capacity of the roots beyond the simple root system. So they extend the capacity of that tree to grow out into soil volume and look for water and nutrients beyond what the root system can contain. It's the same as telephone wires. It's the same as electrical wires. We have that capacity now as a civilization because we've made that network. And the fungi are doing the same thing to their trees. So these are 3 different types of ectomycorrhizal fungi. But the important thing is they grow on a very specific part of the root system. They grow on the roots that are called the short roots. These are the roots that are involved, and they go through the upper 15 centimeters of soil that are intimately involved in the processes where the nutrients are, where the saprophytes are carrying out decomposition. But importantly, the fungus changes the structure of the short root to benefit the plant. So you see these really massive webs of mycelium and roots that are very interconnected in ways that allow the immense amount of information, in this case, it's nutrients, to be translocated between the fungus and the plant in both directions. Now, what's interesting is that for trees, it has been estimated that anywhere between 5 to 45% of the photosynthetic capacity of a tree goes below ground to feed the fungus. So that tree is using a lot of its photosynthetic capability to maintain that relationship. A while back, some foresters said, well, heck, we get rid of the fungus and we can have more wood. And guess what? The trees never grew because they needed that microbiome to do that. So what does this actually look like structurally? So this is a slide through a cross-section of short root, and it's been stained blue to show the fungus. But the fungus produces this thick mantle of mycelium on the outside that's connected with the soil. And then it produces a net over each cortical cell called the Hartig net to allow the communication, because don't forget, this is a symbiosis. These cells have to be alive. These cells are functioning as root cells, communicating back and forth with the fungus and the fungus with the plant. So what do ectomycorrhizae actually do? Well, the major thing is they increase nitrogen uptake to the plant. They help the plant secure nitrogen in an organic form from the surrounding soil. They increase drought tolerance by bringing in water if they can. They increase disease resistance. But importantly, in forests, all trees are interconnected below ground through the web that the fungus builds in that soil over time. Now, what's interesting too is as forests grow, the type of symbionts, the type of fungi that are with them differ as the conditions in the forest change. So seedlings have one group of mycorrhizal fungi, adults have another. And as Dylan knows, when you have a fire go through, if you have a catastrophic fire, you don't only burn off the trees, you burn off all the soil that has the mycorrhizal component, so you're back to completely bare ground that has to start over again, and it may not have the capacity to go in the direction you want because the organisms are no longer there. Now, what species form ectomycorrhizae? Well, it's the conifers, the pines, the spruce, the firs, oaks, pecans, poplars, eucalypts, hickory at large. And for those of you that live in Lubbock, this is a picture of Pistolithus arizus that fruits here in Lubbock. If you have pecan trees or oak trees, if you go out right now underneath your trees, you should see these popping up out of the ground. They call them, the common name are earth balls, and they're related to puffballs, but they're a mycorrhizal species. So your tree has produced these fruit bodies by giving the fungus carbon to make these spores to spread this fungus around. Now, the other form, the arbuscular form, doesn't have anywhere the same structure. This is a tree root where you can see the mycelium coming from the root into the soil. And again, you know, we mentioned about the origin of this can go back 400 million years ago. But when you look at an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus association, it looks completely different. The old term used to be endomycorrhizae because you couldn't see them. What you have to do to see these is you have to clear the cytoplasm out of the root, and then you have to stain them. And one of the major characteristics is that these fungi produce these arbuscules, these very finely branched dendritic structures that interact with the cytoplasmic membrane in each of the cells, and it communicates signals back and forth, again, between the plant and between the fungus. These are living relationships that change over time. They also produce a structure called a vesicle, which stores carbon. And interestingly enough, it's been shown that the fungus can provide carbon both to the itself, but it also can provide carbon to the plant. It will store carbon for its host if it has to. Now, the ectomycorrhizae produce the mushrooms. So a little bit about when you walk out into a forest. If you see mushrooms on the ground, they are all mycorrhizal. If you see mushrooms on wood, they're all saprophytic. Mycorrhizal species do not grow on wood. They only grow on the ground because that's where the tree roots are. They don't fruit on wood. So, but in order to decompose all the wood in the forest, you need those saprophytic fungi to decompose that wood to release nutrients back to the ground for the mycorrhizal forms then to take up and move back to the tree. So there's all this interaction. But in the case of the mycorrhizal fungi that form arbuscular mycorrhizae, they produce these little tiny spores that are less than 1/4 millimeter in diameter, but they blow around. On a windy day, these are all blowing all over Lubbock. This is part of the stuff you breathe in. Because when wind passes over an agricultural field or some grassland, it's going to pick up pieces of soil that have these spores in them. And that's how we work with these fungi, because again, you can't culture these, so you can only identify them by these tiny spores that you can get out of the ground. So what do arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi do? Well, they do something very different. Their main benefit to the plant is to increase phosphorus uptake, not nitrogen. So the distribution of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi is linked to phosphorus availability and the need for phosphorus. So that's one of the reasons why tropical forests are arbuscular mycorrhizal. Those systems are low in phosphorus, and they need that benefit from the fungus. They also make them drought tolerant. You have a hard time growing cotton here if you don't have mycorrhizal fungi on your cotton. If you don't, you have to fertilize up the wazoo to get them to do the same thing. They're also disease resistant, and like the ectomycorrhizal forms, they interconnect up multiple plants. Now, this is the oldest group of mycorrhizal fungi. It is the most common form of mycorrhizal fungi. These are all, not all, but a vast majority of the types of trees that form mycorrhizal relationships. Everything we eat in terms of fruit, all of the major trees that we see in our eastern deciduous or temperate forests fall into these categories also. we can't grow. So for example, you can't grow a citrus tree without its mycorrhizal symbiont. If you don't have it, the seedling will not grow at all. They're obligate. Now, a little bit, again, a cross comparison between the two so you can put this into perspective. The panel on the right of the diagram shows the ectomycorrhizal forms with all the mycelium on the outside. And then the one on the left are the arbuscular forms with all the fungus inside the root and nothing on the outside. And there's a real distinction as to why. Part of it has to do with how roots grow of these types of plants versus short roots of conifers and oaks. And the fungus is simply responding to that plant dynamic. And lastly, as has been mentioned, these ectomycorrhizal fungi connect up all of the trees, the major trees within a forest, and transfer carbon back and forth between those species. Again, you need the saprophytic forms to degrade, to provide those nutrients, and the mycorrhizal forms move it. And the same is true for adjacent plants with AMF. We know, using tracer studies, that plants move carbon between each other through the mycorrhizal fungi. Forests cannot exist without this interconnectedness. In fact, forests connect and interact with each other, dealing with insects, nutrient status, and environmental conditions through their mycorrhizal network. We communicate through computers and cell phones. Trees connect and plants interconnect themselves through their mycorrhizal network. So thank you very much, and appreciate you being here. Bruce, you're muted. You're still muted.
There we go. Yeah, wow. That was wonderful, John. Okay, moving right along, let's just go to Dylan now and learn about something that's been on our mind and not in a good way. The fires, the forest fires out west, but I believe we're going to learn they're not necessarily terrible. But Dylan, thanks a lot for teaching us something about this topic. Okay, Dylan, you need to unmute.
Yep, sorry, my pleasure. So we've been talking quite globally and broadly about forests, and I'm going to just narrow us down a little and look at some of the forests that are closest to us here in Lubbock. As Bruce mentioned earlier, they're really, so in our area of West Texas, there are not really any forests nor any mountains, but there are not too far away. If we go out into the Trans-Pecos, we find patches of forests in these large mountain ranges like the Guadalupe Mountains, the Davis Mountains, and the Chisos Mountains down in Big Bend. And the desert mountain ranges of the US Southwest are often referred to as sky islands because they support patches of cooler, wetter environment at these higher elevations, surrounded by a sea of desert. So they are islands of habitat for those species of plants and animals that do best in those wetter, cooler conditions and with all the resources that trees can provide, because that's where you're going to find trees in these landscapes. These are important for plant diversity, they're important for animals. So these patches of forest are very important to both resident populations and migratory populations of animals as well. So if we look at one of these landscapes, and here we're looking north, up the slope in the Guadalupes, looking down Dog Canyon in the Guadalupes to the north. We're not actually at the highest elevations. There are still some pine forests above us, but we're looking down at a few scattered trees, not really forest, but there are patches of forest and patches of dense tree vegetation down low in the landscape. And so if you look at this, you might guess, we see that these trees can't survive everywhere in this landscape. And you might say, well, what restricts trees to those particular spots in the landscape? And you might guess that it has something to do with water, and you would be correct. Those low places in the landscape are wetter, and that's where water drains to. And so we have patches of forest. We've got oak forest. We've got some Doug fir even. In this photograph, there are probably, you can't identify them, there are probably some Douglas fir even down in the, among the ponderosa pines in these canyons down here. Now these Sky Island forests, which also includes some even higher elevation southwestern pine forests, are of concern because these are trees at the edge of their physiological tolerance, right? If conditions were cool and wet enough lower down, they would move down slope. They're restricted to these higher elevations, or sometimes relatively low spots within high elevations because of certainly water, potentially temperature as well. So you can get pine forests, you can get these patches of forests in the canyons that can look a little bit like an eastern deciduous forest. Perhaps the sotol here, the sotol and bear grass might give this away as being in a desert mountain range. But we can have maples and oaks and these, so now we're in a mostly angiosperm flowering plant dominated forest patch that if we back up a little bit, what you can see is just a patch in this landscape. This is also in the Guadalupe Mountains near Smith Spring. So we have a patch of forest with some junipers and some pines, as well as oaks and maples down near the water, near the spring. But it isn't just water that controls where plants live on this landscape. And if we go back to, well, let me show you one more. Here's an area that is less forested than it was before one of the larger fires, before the Livermore Complex fire in the Davis Mountains. But this big tree survived, and that's a pretty good sized tree for West Texas. That's the Grand Champion ponderosa pine for Texas. So, but it survived the fire due to its thick bark, while some of the smaller trees around it were consumed. So if we go back to that photograph I showed you first, there's a hint in this photograph of another process that's controlling tree distribution. And you can see a partially charcoal blackened dead stem in the foreground. And that's the remains of a probably a fire-killed tree. And in fact, if you look around this landscape up on the slopes, you will find evidence that there was at least a scattered woodland, if not a forest, on these slopes prior to fire. But recurrent fire tends to burn the drier upland parts of the landscapes and often skips over those canyons. And so to some extent, the water is still controlling where plants live, but it's not just because those trees need water. It's because those wetter, cooler canyons are refugia from fire. The fire doesn't tend to burn into them. And we find patterns like out throughout the world, and especially in the Western US, where you have arid landscapes with topography and patches of forest in sometimes wetter areas or areas that can escape fire. All right, so there's, this is not burning really through a forest, it's burning from some juniper woodland down into a desert shrubland below the mountains. But you can see that these fires can consume all the above ground vegetation. They don't always do that. Fires can be quite patchy. Here's the aftermath of a fire in the Davis Mountains near Fort Davis, Texas. This is on Nature Conservancy land. And this was a pretty fairly established older stand of southwestern white pine, Pinus strobiformis. You can see some individuals up closer to the rocks at the top of the photograph survived the fire. But the fire here burned through as a crown fire, consumed those trees, and the pines in that photograph aren't able to resprout. If they're hit by a fire like that, they're dead. Perhaps surprising to some people is that it's really in this photograph, it's only the pines that are killed just because they're all consumed above ground. Most of the other plants in this system can resprout from underground storage organs, from the root crown, from rhizomes, etc. But you can see the fire didn't burn all of this landscape. Once again, there were patches that survived. They were areas where there was maybe lighter fuel loads due to rocks, and also probably wetter areas where there was runoff from these rocks above. And also weather the day of the fire can move fires around. But there are consistently parts of the landscape that burn more frequently and parts that escape fire for longer periods of time. So the condition of the plants prior to the fire influences how the fire burns. Here's a photograph of a nearby slope, not quite the same one, but a little bit distant, that was taken before the fire. And you can see, hopefully in this, that there are large patches of brown on this hillside. This was the result of the, at that time, really the 2011 extreme drought period that resulted in a lot of stem dieback and tree mortality due to to drought stress. And that those created conditions for more intense fire when the fires did burn. And although I'm talking about West Texas and not what's going on in California, the extremely hot conditions, which leads to tree death, but also just temperature hugely can control how fire behaves during a fire. Those conditions have led to some, and there's other things going on as well, but have led to extraordinarily, to firestorms essentially that create their own weather in some of the enormous number of fires that are occurring right now in the Western US. So there's this concern, realistic concern, that under a warming climate that we're facing due to anthropogenic climate change, we are going to lose these patches of forests on the top of these mountains because presumably they'll be pushed off the top of the mountains. And there's evidence that these forests are under increasing stresses from warming climate. But as trees move around, or as vegetation moves, it can be more complicated than simply moving upslope. Here's an example from Ecuador. So this is from a paper, a nice paper written a few years ago, 2015, from researchers who went back to the Chimborazo volcano in Ecuador and recorded plant species distribution. And they essentially repeated some of the vegetation sampling that Alexander von Humboldt had done in 1802. So we had a long period of potential change, and not surprisingly, there's been warming, glaciers, snow levels retreated, the alpine grasslands expanded upslope, but some of those grasslands expanded downslope as well. They just expanded. And they attributed that to increased fire activity, which was largely anthropogenic, human-caused burning. So we can have disturbance interacts with climate change, and plants can respond to disturbances such as fire on really short timescales. So the work I'm going to show you is work that was all done in these 3 mountain ranges. There are others. These are 3 we had access to, right? This is western, the Trans-Pecos of Texas, and so it's mostly private land other than one national park here and another national park here. And then we very luckily have access to some Nature Conservancy land in the Davis Mountains. Right, there's a few other mountain ranges that are completely privately owned. I won't go through this, but just quickly, I should acknowledge all the students and graduate students and undergrads who helped with work we've done in these mountain ranges in the past. So I feel bad if I didn't at least quickly put some photographs up of them. So if we're going to predict what's going to happen to these trees under a changing climate, we'd like to have a good idea of mechanistically what controls their distribution now. I mean, we know they're up in these mountain ranges, but they're not everywhere in them, the trees, and different trees inhabit different places. But we don't really always have a good idea of exactly what controls them. So my lab's worked on some plant physiology addressing this question, which I won't talk about too much, as well as some attempts to do some broader scale modeling and really measure climate, microclimate across these mountain ranges. And the idea of this was, could we build really fine scale climate maps that we could then use to understand tree distributions? So we can put these inexpensive temperature sensors across these mountain ranges. We left them out for several years, going back to look at them. Then we can look at how local weather patterns and then topography influence microclimate. So things like it's cooler up high, but then there's also cold air draining down at night that makes it colder down in the valleys. We can build models of what predicts temperature and soil moisture. And then we can project those into the future using some of the projections we have for a warming climate in the region under various emission scenarios and potential climate change up over the next couple hundred years. And so then we can potentially build maps of how species might change their distribution. So let's look at that a little bit. First of all, I just want to show you that it's kind of complicated. Yes, on average, it's warmer down low in the landscapes. If you get down to the deserts, it's lower there than, and it's going to be, it's warmer down in the low desert down by the Rio Grande than it is up in the basin and the Chisos for where your campground is. But daytime highs and nighttime lows show different patterns. This graph shows on the y-axis number of freezing nights in late winter and spring, so January through March, number of freezes. And I'll just draw your attention to this middle plot. We're looking across elevations here from sort of the lowest elevations at which we get trees, sort of juniper and oak woodland, savanna, up to pretty dense coniferous forests at 2,300 meters, 2,400 meters. And if we look at the Davis Mountains, we can see that in this watershed we're working in, it's freezing more nights down low than it is up high because of cold air draining down at night. We can look at the Guadalupe Mountains, and it's kind of complicated. It's freezing the most at intermediate elevations. And in the Chisos Mountains down in Big Bend, there's not as a strong relationship with elevation. Now, of course, it's not just elevation that controls temperature. When we build these models, we can actually get a lot more explanatory power by looking at local air sheds and relative slope position and those sorts of things. But just to show you that it's not as simple as always being colder up high. And you know this if you've camped in a mountain range and you put your tent down in a valley where the cold air drains down at night. Okay, soil moisture is probably more important than temperature directly to the plants, but it's harder to measure over a long period. So we didn't have a lot of money, so we have pretty terrible data on soil moisture. We just have it for 1 year at one time period. But again, it isn't always wetter up higher. So again, these forests exist at the higher elevations, but it's not a linear increase in tree cover with elevation. So if we look at these three mountain ranges, the Chisos mountain range, the Davis mountain range, and the Guadalupes on the right, we have elevation, and it's kind of a higgledy-piggledy pattern of soil moisture with elevation. This is late spring soil moisture, sort of April 2014. But we can put all this together. We can project soil moisture and temperature into the future. We can build maps of what temperature looks like now and what it might look like under different scenarios for the future. And here's one example from the Davis Mountains. We have spring minimum temperatures, so how cold it gets in spring when trees are thinking about leafing out and producing new leaves, the deciduous trees, and growing. And you can see that in the Davis Mountains, yes, it's warmer down low. It's coldest at sort of intermediate elevations, and then actually the very tops of the peaks are projected to be not quite as cold. And everything just gets warmer under climate change because we assume that the topography effect stays constant. We sort of assume that's sort of built into our assumptions, that the topography effect won't change. So we build all these models, a lot more than I've shown you, and then we say, does it predict where trees grow? Because if we can predict where they grow now from climate models, then we can predict where they at least would be suitable in the future if they can get there, and their mycorrhizal symbionts can get there. However, the models are pretty terrible at predicting where the trees live now. So it predicts where they grow a little, but the models are pretty, even with soil moisture and so forth, they're not that good. The trees are doing stuff we don't totally understand. And part of it is we have pretty terrible measures of soil water availability. It's hard to get at what water the plants are actually seeing, right? Their roots are deep. Our soil moisture estimates are terrible, but we can use proxies about topography, and even that's not that great at getting at it. But we can do it anyway, right? We got paid to do this, so we should do it anyway. And we can look at predicted suitable habitat for, here's emery oak, one of the trees in the Chisos Mountains in Big Bend. Predicted suitable habitat under the historical climate on the left. That doesn't mean you find these trees everywhere within there. It already is over predicting. And then predicted suitable habitat under a high emission scenario in the future under quite a bit of warming. And according to this, which I don't believe, so don't take this to the bank, it's just going to expand its range. It's not going to lose much at the low elevation, and it's going to move up, and all these cliffs along the south rim are going to be packed with emery oak. And the problem is that our models right now don't predict well where you find it. You don't find it evenly throughout this because it's really, emery oak is definitely restricted by some access to deep to some soil moisture. It's not as much a dry site specialist as some species. It can't handle as dry sites as this would predict at the low elevations. This is the Chisos Mountains right in the center. Okay, so doesn't do perfectly. So part of that is we don't have probably great measurements, and part of it is this doesn't capture all the other things that influences tree distribution, right? I don't really trust that projection. Fire and episodic drought probably have much more profound effects than temperature changes alone, gradual temperature change. So we've had drought in these mountain ranges. We have, this is a photo from the Chisos Mountains in Big Bend. And you can see in this photograph, there are a lot of dead trees on the landscape. You might also notice they tend to be the pinyon pine. It's a desert tree species. But that's actually what was dying first in some of these areas during the 2011, 12, 13 sort of extended drought and some other interesting weather that went on then. So we had a lot of tree dieback. What's going on? If we look, we can see that it looks like, at least in this mountain range, the pines were the hardest hit. Pinyon pine, but also some other pine species as well. And so this is work that undergrads, and a course I teach data they took over several years of field trips. And we just saw declining pine live cover over several periods when we first started going in 2010 until in 2014 and 15, I think we went. So declining cover in pines, they're just dying. The oaks, on the other hand, weren't seeing such a dramatic decline. Some areas we'd go in and we'd see, oh, the oaks have had 100% death. And then we go back the next year and we're like, oh, now they're only 50% dead. Right? We've got, because oaks can resurrect. Unlike the pines in this system, the oaks can resprout. And the oaks in that case were treating drought the same way they treat fire, which is to regrow from dormant buds. So they need to have buds beneath the bark or beneath the soil that were not killed by the fire, so the fire can't, or by the drought in this case. And they need to have carbon that they can mobilize to regrow. And the oaks were able to do this. There are some pines that can resprout, some conifers that can resprout, but it's rarer in conifers. All right, so the oaks are treating drought like they treat fire, and they're resprouting. So what happens during drought? Well, the water is being pulled out by the atmosphere is very dry, and water's leaving the pores in the leaves. The water column acts like a stick being pulled apart because of the polar bonds between water molecules. The soil's dry, it's holding on to water at the other end, and that stick can get cracked apart, and that water column fails under extreme drought, and you get an embolism event or a cavitation. Right? This is all happening under sort of negative pressures, under tension. And so that stick being pulled apart in the plant can just crack apart, and we can get a cavity. And then we have no more water flow from the roots to the leaves, and the stem dies from the tips back. And if you drove around central Texas during those drought years, or again now if we've had some other ones, you can see in 2011, it was really obvious seeing junipers that were dying from the tips back towards the main stem as those vessels embolized. And some folks have measured this. We've measured in our lab in one way. Other folks have listened with very fine acoustic instruments, and you can hear those little implosions, those explosions happening in the stem as the vessels embolize. So embolism and drought produce that dry landscape, which then burns in the fire, but not all of the landscape burns, and not all of the landscape is equally dry. And so we have really patchy fire because of that. We have, as a combination of several factors. At the lowest elevations, we have grass-dominated fuels and just patchy trees. And we have very fast fire that doesn't cause much soil heating, doesn't kill any soil microorganisms. All the heat goes up and out. It might kill some trees if there's patches of trees there, but many trees will survive if they have thick bark or they can resprout. We can have fire that burns as a crown fire through a forest. This is a pretty reasonably tall stand of silverleaf oak that burned in a crown fire. And then we can have patches of these trees that survive fire down in the canyons. And so we have this sort of, on a small scale, on the scale of sometimes a half mile or so, you can have really differences in which trees live in the various areas. You have sort of north slope and high elevation specialists that prefer wetter sites. you have the dry site specialist trees that are down lower elevation or on the south-facing slopes. And the fuel loads differ between these, with more grass fuels and fewer canopies touching one another at the dry sites. And so fire here tends to be more frequent. There's a lot of flashy fuel to ignite, but burn with low intensity. Fire up on the more dense slopes where it's wetter probably occurs less frequently, but when it does burn, there's more available fuel to burn. And if those trees have been stressed by drought, then there's more available to burn. And so we find that in these landscapes, the sort of dry site specialists tend to be the ones that invest in thick bark when they're young and often can survive fire. And here we have the gray oak, Quercus grisea, resprouting from its beneath the bark in its stems after the fire. So it lost all its leaves in the fire, and all the green, sort of light green you see there is new leaves that have resprouted. Here you have a tree that was completely top killed. This stand, all connected under the ground, it's really one tree. This stand of silverleaf oak was completely top killed. Everything above ground was killed, but the trees are resprouting from the root crown. And they'll grow again. And everything in this system resprouts, except the pines. Even out here, we even have a resprouting juniper that you can see here. The alligator juniper out in West Texas can resprout and forms a swollen resprouting organ at its base. But these fires, if they often don't kill the individual plants, but they will set the system back. The pines, however, can be killed by the fire if the fire consumes them. If they often have thick bark to survive it. So we have these thick bark species, and I've had students who've looked at that bark thickness. There's the gray oak. It puts on bark very early as a seedling. We have species like the silverleaf oak, which doesn't put on bark till it's really an old tree. These also tend to be the species that die first under really dry conditions. They like wetter sites. And that has consequences then that we have sort of trees that are more susceptible to fire when it occurs and have invested more in resprouting and not trying to survive it, and trees that actually invest more in surviving the fire above ground with thick bark in these other grass fuel dominated south slopes. Okay, I won't even go into that. That's just proving that these trees are differently susceptible to drought, but we don't need to go into the physiology. So all of this means that you have different types of fire that's in part a feedback from the plants that live there. And so we can have grass-driven fire, doesn't burn very hot. Look, even this little sotil survived with green in the center. Doesn't even killed by the fire. We can also have much more dense fuel systems where we get crown fire. This is a shrubland, not a forest, but the same idea applies. So I'm just going to make a couple final comments. This is just a quick introduction to these systems. What will happen with fire under climate change, right? We think that in general, we're going to reduce some area for these plants to live because it's warmer, but it's not so clear because they're not necessarily being pushed off the top. We do think that this dieback and xylem failure, that's the water conducting tissue in the plant, that's going to lead to drier fuels, and combined with the warmer temperatures that we're seeing, higher probability of stand replacing crown fire that actually top kills the plants or even kills them in the case of the pines. So the non-sprouting pines are probably the most vulnerable to that kind of crown fire as well. And we might get a more oak dominated system. Whether the resprouters like the oaks can persist is an open question. So far they've done well and are probably expanding in some areas at the expense of the pine forest. And also additionally, there's reason to suggest that the higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere might be favoring resprouters in some cases. Still, we can get death due to drought. They don't always survive drought. At some point, they can be killed as well. So in the short term, drought probably leads to dieback and more intense crown fire. In the longer term, we might end up seeing in these systems a shift with the die-off of forest and a shift to more open grass-dominated systems that look a little like the lower elevations. So fire and climate together might end up turning these systems to look more like the lower elevations. And with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dylan. Wow, I really appreciate your bringing us into your methods of analyzing these forest landscapes. Although I took your final point to be the overall effect we expect from climate change is less forests, more grass. So which is going in the wrong direction. But well, thanks everybody. I don't see any questions on the Q&A right now. Hopefully, or well, if people have some, we'd love to inject them into the conversation. But I thought, well, we've got our panel here. Okay, we've got Daniel McGrath, and he's asking a question. This would be for Dylan. Down in the hill country is Lost Maples State Park. Would that be considered a sky island?
No, because that's usually reserved for mountain ranges that stick up into the sky, but that is a really interesting, that it's a microclimate where that has supported those maples much further west from more continuous distributions of the maples. So they're the lost maples for that reason. So that particular microclimate and water availability, it's a similar sort of island effect, but you wouldn't usually call it a sky island, but that's kind of semantics.
Where is that exactly?
Those are down in the hill country. I have to look exactly what county it's in.
Oh, okay. Over
patches of, and it's a state park where there are
east of us.
Maples, yeah, east of us, but pretty far west. So not in West Texas, but far west for that species of maple.
Okay. Well, I thought I've got I came up with a question I want to throw out to the panel in no particular order, but seeing as this conversation is sponsored by the Humanities Center, I thought I'd ask each of you, thinking about your talks, on the one hand, it was refreshing to be taken into the landscape of forests over the long evolutionary durations that we've been talking about. So of course the human, the question or just the matter of the human was evacuated from the discussion by the nature of the topics we took up. But I wonder if you were asked to put the human back in to your, to the landscape of your discussion. I'm just saying, let me try to get started with Sankar, because Sankar brought us up to the time of the proliferation of the flowering plants after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So we're on the way to Homo sapiens as part of this sort of rise of the mammalian form of life coming into more recent geological time. Sankar, do you have something to say about sort of Homo sapiens apropos your discussion?
Sure. We have a tenure of 7 million years, okay? Called, hominin or the human fossils. We have a 7 million years record. And for most of the time, for 90% of the time, we lived in the forest. We are hunter-gatherers. We really came to the open land only 12,000 years ago. We started agriculture. We had a great sort of devotion, love, to the land. And this continued for a long time until we started harnessing coal, which of course came from the forest. And that industrial revolution made us greedy. We started destroying our landscape. Yes. So it took, think about it, it took almost 400 million years to produce this beautiful forest. And now, 10,000 years, maybe 300 years history, we are capable or able to destroy. And so we're the most aggressive species. You know, our name has to be changed from wise men to, you know, Homo destructive, something like that.
John, what do you think? I really enjoyed the deep dive into the diversity of the fungal kingdom that you brought forward to us. Of course, you brought out our love of mushrooms, which is pretty, I imagine, universal to the human taste bud. What else might you say if you just kind of put our way of life back into the picture?
So I think from my perspective, I think there are three avenues where we really don't think through some of the impact of humans on forests, and that is one is the introduction of invasive species that are detrimental either as pathogens such as chestnut blight, or there's currently a series of hemlock blights that are killing all the hemlocks back east, or the Phytophthora that was brought in to Australia that's wiping out the eucalypts. So our capability of bringing in pathogens and redistributing organisms across the globe in ways that they could not have otherwise has been destructive. Also, we're bringing in, look at the emerald ash borer and the destruction of ash trees throughout North America coming over from China, the chestnut, the elm blights. That's one. The other one, which most people don't pay attention to, is that we as humans deposit an enormous amount of nitrogen into the atmosphere that then gets deposited back into the landscape. And one of its most detrimental effects is to decrease the mycorrhizal capability of trees in that landscape where you have, so you're over fertilizing the world due to our industrial efforts. And so right now, for example, because of pollution out of the LA basin, they're estimating that there will be no Joshua trees in Joshua National Park as a consequence of fungal change. If you go back and look at a Great Smoky Mountains National Park, all of that red spruce that was on the mountaintops has all been killed because of acid rain and nitrogen deposition. But the same thing happens in Big Bend. The same thing happens, as I spoke before. So through indirect activities of us, we redistribute nutrients and we redistribute organisms around the planet in ways that are deleterious to the whole ecological functioning of those systems.
Are there remediations that?
No.
Oh.
No. I mean, the pathogen there is no remediation for the pathogens. I mean, it's taken us 100 years to figure out some way to build a chestnut tree that is resistant. In terms of nitrogen, there is. Stop burning fossil fuels. But, you know.
Were they successful in creating a chestnut tree that doesn't get taken down by that blight? I've looked at the websites and you see, I mean, it's been decades that they've been trying to bring back the chestnut. Are they having any success with that?
The latest introductions were in 2018, so they've only been out in the fields for 2 years, but the initial laboratory tests are they have enough of the resistance genes in the current clones, in the current lines of these chestnuts, that they're likely to survive. The issue is they're no longer genetically pure American chestnut. That's all gone. I mean, now there are American chestnuts that have survived, but those are on borrowed time. And so they're trying to create this new super chestnut that has resistance gene out of the Chinese that they can then go back and replant. I mean, again, but we've done that with corn. We've done that with other trees. We've done that with all of our fruit trees to keep them from being infected by pathogens. We're just now dealing with a major forest species. But it took 100 years to do that.
And a good 100 years to get a decent sized tree.
That's right.
Well, so we need to plan for the long term here. Dylan, you know, the question's a bit off the wall. I was curious, these landscapes look pretty untouched by human habitation, but is that actually the case?
No, I mean, because I try to keep this short and like introduce people to some of the biology of these systems, they have an idea to learn about and introduce some of the subtlety of how fire works. I've left out a lot of things. And of course, right now we have California going on, and there's a lot of talk about land management and so forth and its role in those fires. But of course, this fire is one of the major tools that humans have used to manage landscapes for hunter-gatherer societies, agricultural societies, right, for a long time. And so the Western US had a lot of areas that were very heavily managed landscapes. And then you had a period where that management really changed. You had genocide of the peoples that were on those lands, and you had real changes in fire regime because of that. And if you look at fire scars, say in Sequoia National Park, you can see they were burning. You can look at in the tree rings, you can see when fires occurred because of the scarring. You can see they're every 12 years, and then they stop well before there's any fire suppression, well before there's much Anglo-American settlement, but coincident with the destruction of the Native American societies that were there. So, these have been managed landscapes, and fire there's natural lightning fire, but there's a lot of anthropogenic fire, and there always has. And today, we're one of the major, both planned and unplanned ignitions are largely human caused. So, I mean, it's a huge topic, but no, these are heavily human influenced in many cases. These fires were often, that I actually showed you, those ones were lightning caused fires. But the landscape, if you go back to at least the 19th century and earlier, was one in which there were fires that were management fires by Native Americans. So.
Right. We've got a question from Vicky Sutton. Let me throw this to the panel. She writes, a cactus isn't really a tree, but my question is about evolution that would lead to trees. Do you think the cactus on our landscape in Lubbock are the descendants of corals from under the sea that once covered Lubbock? Some of the cacti look like elkhorn coral. Who wants to?
They're angiosperms. They're angiosperms. So
Not at all.
flowering plants.
So cactus are flowers. Well, that's right. They flower.
And they're a recent group. 8 million. Well, I don't know how 8 million years or so only. The Cactaceae.
Really? That recent?
Sure.
Well, there you go.
And also, plants, then fungi, then animals, okay? So animals cannot give rise to plants. They have to go, reverse way via fungi to plants. So this coral thing has no evolutionary.
It's just a morphological.
Right. They look alike.
John, I've got it. My question for you was, so I was, in my little introduction, I talked about what this reading concerning the partnership of the fungi with the very earliest plants as part of what enabled them to come onto land. But then you told us that the mycorrhizal fungi are the most recently evolved. So what form would the do we even know? And this also may be a question for Sankar. Do we know what the fungi were like that were these very earliest fungi that must have been present in, at some early stage in their evolution, but still enough to be effective in partnering up with the aquatic plants, I guess,
right,
in order for that consortium to move on to land.
So it turns out that indeed, when I was spoken about the most recently, it's the larger fungi, it's the mushrooms and the morels that are the most recently evolved mycorrhizal. The Glomeromycota, their fossil record goes back to almost the origin of land plants.
Exactly.
They go back, you can find them in the fossil record. So Sankar was talking about the non-vascular plants, the mosses, the liverworts, the ferns. They were all back with them prior to the evolution of conifers and then angiosperms. I mean, it's interesting that when you go back and look at the origin of fungi, there's a really interesting response of fungi to the radiation of angiosperms and the evolution of pathogens of fungi in response to all that. So they were, and again, conifers originated in the tropics and migrated northward. And when the giant supercontinent was there, so those forests and those fungi evolved as they changed climate, moving from tropical to more northern latitudes. But the fungi evolved with them to deal with a seasonal component, and mushrooms are part of that relationship.
True.
So what's interesting is that when you go to a tropical region, the fungi, there are mushrooms in the tropic, but they're all saprophytes. There's no mycorrhizal fungi that are responding to the changes in the plant host.
Okay. How are we doing? Would the panelists care to pose a question to their colleagues?
We are friends.
Not a critique, just a question.
I do have one. So if those of you that are not in the natural sciences, what would you write and say to the rest of your community about what we've talked about tonight that would be important for them to know?
Wonderful.
I guess I should, hey, Mike, why don't you field that one?
Can you hear me? The through line, I think, is how destructive humans have been in all of these environments. And I actually think I was struck, John, in your presentation, the reframing for me of how we think about fungal matter, right? That humans have a natural aversion to it, but it's actually pretty useful in the way you described it in a myriad of ways. So for me, I think this is really true to the theme of forests for the Humanities Center all year, is how misguided humanity is over and over again, and how we think about these environments and how we think about these ecosystems. I think all three of you did a wonderful job of offering a kind of corrective for just the way that, you know, our perspective is so off the mark, and I'm grateful for that.
So one of the things I'm doing a lot of reading on for another class I teach is, I think part of this issue about not realizing the larger perspective, in some ways it's no different than moral relativism, right? It's only how I see the world is what's important and how it operates. Forget about the reality of it.
Yeah, and the reality that all three of you presented was a stark one. And I mean, I like, you know, Professor Chatterjee's description. I think you called us Homo destructus, and I think that's absolutely the message that I walked away from. So I would you know, bring a message of caution to everyone I encounter after tonight.
Well, what I want to say is that fungi are the new bacteria, right? So in that it took us so long to realize that the bacteria are our friends 99.9% of the time.
Yep.
But even as microbiology gradually unfolded, and this, you know, very recently, did we have the technology to do the genetic sequencing and really understand the microbiota, so that gets me back to the theme that I think is the message, you know, is we're, and it you know, you may well know, it goes back to Lynn Margulis's message, which is still a perfectly important and necessary message, that we live on a symbiotic planet and we've got to just reintegrate with the contingencies of the biosphere. And if we don't, we're sunk, you know. But there must be a way. If we could have some rational leadership, for Christ's sake, to lead us out of, you know, out of these deserts of ignorance, even to the sky islands of possible habitation. So there you have it.
So one of the things, so when I also talk to cotton producers, and so the ability to grow cotton here, you don't need the fungi, but it's going to cost you an enormous amount of money and water to do that. And so the question is, how do you manage your soil microbiome so you allow the beneficial fungi to stay there? And what do you have to do? And so that's why no-till and stubble management is becoming more and more prevalent, because it's costing too much money to do otherwise. And so the groups that I interact with, you keep talking long enough about the same things, whether it's a cotton field or whether it's a grass in your front yard or whether it's some forest, they all function with the same parameters. Different organisms evolve, but the ecological processes are all the same. And so the question is, how do you convince them that the least we stay out of the process, the better off we're going to be?
The more we stay out of it.
The more we stay out.
And couldn't you tell them it's a lot cheaper to use a new tilling method than to buy all that industrial fertilizer?
No, that's exactly right. They know how much it costs to drive a tractor. So if you don't have to drive a tractor, you don't have to spray. You put on 50% less nitrogen or 50% less phosphorus. Your bottom line is much better.
All right then. How can we get Bruce's awesome poster, says an anonymous attendee. My fine poster back here I got from the American Society for Cybernetics. And email me, there might still be some available. The last time I talked to the man I got these from, he was trying to get me to take more to like clear out his closet. So I could fix you up, anonymous attendee, if you got to have it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I think we're good, and I hope I speak for our attendees in general that this was super informative and just important knowledge that we were able. And of course, it's now going to be archived for time immemorial. So that's a good thing. That's all I got for you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Be well. Thanks.
Just in closing, I would say on behalf of the Humanities Center, thank you to all of you, all four of you tonight, for such a great series of presentations and conversations. I also want to always give thanks to the Humanities Center staff. So Justin Hughes, Tara Akopi, and Callie Watson, who help us promote events and get the word out. Please, if you're attending tonight, go to the Humanities Center website and register for all the rest of the events. This has been a great series of conversations in this first two. So thanks very much again.
Thanks so much. Bye, Michael. Thanks. Bye, all.
Bye now.